Guys, so back for more chapters. If you remember last chapter, Nick had come up with a new idea and they started calling pens Frindles because of something that Miss Granger had told him that he decides what the words mean. Chapter 7 Word Wars. School was the perfect place to launch a new word, and since this was a major historical event, Nick wanted it to begin in exactly the right class. Seventh period, language arts. Nick raised his hand first thing after the bell rang and said, Miss Granger, I forgot my Frindle. Sitting 3 rows away, John blurted out, I have an extra one you can borrow, Nick. Then John made a big show of looking for something in his backpack. I think I have an extra Frindle. I told my mom to get me 3 or 4. I'm sure I had an extra Frindle in here yesterday, but I must have taken it out. Wait, oh yeah, here it is. And then John made a big show of throwing it over to Nick, and Nick missed it on purpose. Then he made a big show of finding it. Mrs. Granger and every kid in the class got the message loud and clear. That black plastic thing that Nick borrowed from John had a funny name, a different name, a new name. Frindle. There was a lot of giggling, but Mrs. Granger turned up the power in her eyes and swept the room into a silence. And the rest of the class went back by according to plan. Her plan. As everyone was leaving after class, Mrs. Granger said, Nicholas, I'd like to have a word with you. And she emphasized the word word. Nick's mouth felt dry and he gulped, but his mind stayed clear. He walked up to her desk. Yes, Mrs. Granger. It's a funny idea, Nicholas, but I will not have my class disrupted again. Is that clear? Her eyes were lit up, but it was mostly light, not much heat. Idea? What idea? Asked Nick, and he tried to make his eyes as blank as possible. You know what I mean, Nicholas. I am talking about the performance that you and John gave at the start of class. I am talking about this. And she held up her pen, an old maroon fountain pen with a blue cap. But I really didn't have a Frindle with me, said Nick, amazed at his own bravery. And hiding behind his glasses, Nick kept his eyes wide and blank. Mrs. Granger's eyes flashed and then narrowed, and her lips formed a thin, hard line. She was quiet for a few seconds, and then she said, I see. Very well. Then I guess we have nothing more to discuss today, Nicholas. You may go. Thanks, Miss Granger, said Nick, and he grabbed his backpack and headed to the door. And when he was just stepping into the hallway, he said, and I promise I won't ever forget my Frindle again. Bye. Chapter 8 Mightier Than the Sword. 2 days later, the photographer came to take class pictures. The fifth grade picture would be taken right after lunch. That gave Nick and his secret agents plenty of time, and they whispered something into the ear of every fifth grader. All the individuals' pictures had been taken, and finally it was time for the group picture. Everyone was lined up on the auditorium stage. Everyone's hair looked great, and everyone was smiling. But when the photographer said cheese, no one did. Instead, every kid said Frindle, and they held one up for the camera to see. The photographer was out of film, so that shot was the only fifth grade group picture he took. 6 of the fifth graders' teachers were not pleased, and Miss Granger was furious. No one really wanted to make the teachers mad. It was just fun. It also got all the kids in the school talking about the new word. And when people picked up a new word, they say it all the time. The kids at Lincoln Elementary School liked Nick's new word a lot. Not Mrs. Granger. The day after the class picture, she made an announcement to each of her classes, and she posted a notice on the main bulletin board by the office. Anyone who is heard using the word Frindle instead of the word pen will stay after school and write this sentence 100 times. I am writing this punishment with a pen, Mrs. Granger. But that just made everyone want to use Nick's word even more. Staying after school with the lone Granger became a badge of honor. There were kids in her classroom every day after school. It went on like that for a couple of weeks. One day, near the end of seventh period, Mrs. Granger asked Nick to come talk to her after school. This is not detention, Nicholas. I just want to talk. Nick was excited. It was kind of like a conference during a war. One side waves a white flag and the generals come out and talk. General Nicholas Allen. Nick liked the sound of it. He stuck his head in Mrs. Granger's doorway after school. You wanted to talk with me, Nick? Yes, Nicholas, please come in and sit down. When he was settled, she looked at him and said, don't you think this Frindle business has gone far enough? It's just a disruption to school. Don't you think? Nicholas swallowed hard, but he said, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just fun. And it really is a real word. It's not a bad word, just different. And besides, it's how words really change, isn't it? That's what you said. Mrs. Granger sighed. It is how a word could be made up brand new, I suppose. But the word pen should really be replaced by that other word. The word pen has a long, rich history. It comes from the Latin word of feather, pinna. It started to become our word pen because quills made from feathers were some of the first writing tools ever made. It's a word that comes from somewhere. It makes sense, Nicholas. But Frindle makes just as much sense to me, said Nick. And after all, didn't someone just make up the word Pina too? That got a spark from Miss Granger's eyes, but all she said was, then you are not going to stop this. And Nick looked right in her eyes and said, well, I mean a bunch of my friends, and I took an oath about using the word, and we have to keep our promise. And besides, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I like my word. Nick tried to look brave, but like a good general should. Very well, then. I thought it would end up this way. Mrs. Granger pulled a fat white envelope from her desk drawer and held it up. This is the letter I have written to you, Nicholas. Nick held out his hand, thinking she was going to give it to him, but she didn't. I am not going to send it to you until all this is over. I want you to sign your name and put today's date across the back of the envelope. When you read it, whenever that may be, you will know it is the same letter and that I have not made any changes to it. What do you think's in this letter? Like a conference during war. This is weird, Nick said to himself. But to Mrs. Granger, he said, sure. And he signed his name in his best cursive and put the date under it. And Mrs. Granger stood up abruptly and said, and that is all for today, Nicholas. And may the best word win. There was a frown on her face, but her eyes were different, almost happy. And Nick was halfway down the hall before it hit him. She likes this war, and she wants to win real bad. Walking to school the next day, he had a great idea. How about we see if we can get every kid in the whole fifth grade to go up and ask Mrs. Granger, can I borrow a Frindle? You mean Mrs. Granger, may I borrow a Frindle, said Dave. Gotta use good grammar. Don't want to upset dangerous Grangers. Sounds good to me, said Nick. She can't keep everyone after school, can she? Almost 80 kids stayed after school with Mrs. Granger that day. They filled her room and spilled down to the hallway. The principal had to stay late to help, and they had to arrange 2 special late buses to get all the kids home. And the next day, all the fifth graders did it again. So did a lot of the other students. Over 200 kids. Parents called to complain. The school bus drivers threatened to go on strike. And then the school board and the superintendent got involved. And about this time, the principal of Lincoln Elementary School paid a little visit to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Allen. She wanted to talk about their son, the one in fifth grade, the one named Nick. We'll read one more chapter. 9. Chess. Mrs. Margaret Chapman had been the principal of Lincoln Elementary School for 18 years. She knew Mr. and Mrs. Allen because they had all served together on the building committee when the old Lincoln School was torn down and the new one was built 6 years ago. When she telephoned on the afternoon of October 1st to set up the meeting, Mrs. Chapman had asked Nick to be there too. It was 6:30 when she knocked and Nick opened the door. Good evening, Nick, she said, no smile. Hi, Mrs. Chapman, said Nick, backing away as she filled the doorway. She was a large person, as tall as Nick's dad, with wide shoulders. Nick guessed she would play linebacker on a football team, because that's what his dad had played in college. The game was not over. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Allen," she said, stepping into the living room. She was wearing a long black raincoat with a red silk scarf tied loosely around her neck. She kept her coat on, but took off the scarf and tucked it into her pocket. She shook hands stiffly with both of Nick's parents before sitting down on the chair to the left of the couch. Nick's mom and dad sat on the couch, and Nick sat on the rocking chair that faced Mrs. Chapman across the low coffee table. "This is not an easy visit for me. We are having some trouble at school, and it appears that Nick is in the middle of it." Then, while Nick's parents listened, Mrs. Chapman laid out the story as she saw it: Nick encouraging the other kids to use his new word, Mrs. Granger forbidding it, the ruined fifth grade class picture, hundreds of kids staying after school, and a general feeling that there was a rebellion at school with no one respecting the rules anymore. Nick watched his mom and dad while Mrs. Chapman talked, looking from one face to another. His dad was listening carefully, nodding and frowning. He looked embarrassed about the trouble, but his mom looked kind of annoyed. And when Mrs. Chapman finished her story, Nick's mom was the first one to speak. "But doesn't all this seem like a lot of fuss about something pretty silly?" Nick sat quietly, but in his mind he shouted, "Hooray for Mom! Hooray for mothers everywhere!" His mom wasn't annoyed with him. She was annoyed with Mrs. Granger, maybe even annoyed with Mrs. Chapman. This was getting interesting. Mrs. Allison was still talking to the principal. "I mean, is there really any harm in the children making up a funny word and saying it? Does there have to be a rule that a word like this may not be used?" Mrs. Chapman sighed and said, "Yes, I suppose it does seem silly. Mrs. Granger thinks it's rather like keeping children from saying ain't. There has there have to be rules. That's why we have dictionaries. And really, the problem isn't so much the word itself, it's the lack of respect for authority." Mr. Allen said, "Mrs. Granger's right about that. There have to be rules. We can't have kids walking around saying ain't, can we?" And that's when Nick piped in. "You know that big dictionary in Mrs. Granger's room? The word ain't is right there in the book. I looked it up and there it was. I don't see why I can't use a word if it's in the dictionary. Mrs. Granger even said that her dictionary was the law." Nick looked from face to face to face. That stumped them all. He had just launched a first class thought grenade. "Well, yes, but, well, as I said, the word ain't and even the word Frindle, these are not the real issue here," said Mrs. Chapman. Mrs. Allen said, "Well, I think the real issue is Mrs. Granger's reaction to a harmless little experiment with language. It's an overreaction. Don't you think so, Tom?" And Mrs. Allen looked to her husband. It was Mr. Allen's turn to look from face to face. He was lost. "Yeah, well, sure, I guess so. I mean, it's not like anyone's been hurt. I mean, it's not like vandalism or stealing or something like that." His sentence trailed off, and he rubbed his chin and stared thoughtfully through the window on the wall behind Mrs. Chapman. And while the three grown-ups sat there in an uncomfortable moment of silence, Nick had a sudden vision of what was really going on here. It was a game of chess. Nick against Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Granger had tried to end the game by using her queen, Mrs. Chapman, in her black raincoat, the Black Queen. Nick didn't know it until the attack was underway, but he had a powerful defender of his own. Good old Mom, the White Queen. And the game was not over. It would go on until there was a winner and a loser. Mrs. Chapman didn't stay much longer. There was a little more talk back and forth across the chessboard about how children have a right to explore new ideas, about the importance of respecting teachers and the work they do, about everyone needing to keep up standards and make school a safe place to learn. Then Mr. Allen offered Mrs. Chapman some coffee and banana bread, but she said, "No, thanks, I really must be going now." She thanked Nick's parents, and they thanked her. Nick opened the door and said, "Good night, Mrs. Chapman." Then the Black Queen put on her red scarf and walked off into the October twilight. "Nick, I think we better talk a little more about this," said his mom, sitting back down on the couch. "If I find out that you have been disrespectful to Mrs. Granger or any other teacher at that school, you will be in big trouble." "I haven't been disrespectful, honest. I did get everybody started using my word. But like you said, it's not hurting anybody. And I'm sorry if me and Dave and Pete got everyone to ask Miss Granger to borrow a Frindle. That was mean, I guess. But she started it by making kids stay after school and write 100 sentences just for saying my word once. All the kids like to use my word. It's just fun. That's all. Well, said Nick's dad, if it gets everyone upset and makes the principal come talk to your mother and me, then it's not must not be fun for everybody, is it? And I think you should just tell all your friends to knock it off right now. I mean, tomorrow. Nick shook his head. I can't, Dad. It won't work. It's a real word now. It used to just be mine, but not anymore. If I knew how to stop it, I think I probably would, but I can't. And Nick looked at both of their faces to see if that idea was sinking in. It was, like I said, I won't be disrespectful, but I do like my word. And I guess now we're just going to have to see what happens. And the chessmen, Nick's king and queen, had to agree. The game would go on. Right, I'll stop there.